The winds in the barren plains howled fiercely, the bitter cold slicing through the air like a knife. The vast, unbroken snowfield stretched endlessly before Elizabeth Clark, a woman lost in both body and spirit. It was the dead of winter in the highlands of Montana, 1872, a place where the land itself seemed to want to swallow any sign of life. The air was so cold it felt like it had a life of its own, creeping into her very bones, slowing her down, dragging at her legs with each step. The chill wasn't just a sensation, it was a presence, heavy and suffocating. Elizabeth knew the cold well. She could feel it in her aching limbs, her shallow breaths that barely escaped her lips in the freezing air. But what frightened her the most was the stillness in her arms. She had been holding her daughter, Rose, tightly to her chest, but the little girl had grown too quiet, too still. That was the part that terrified her the most. She had been walking for hours, maybe longer, through the unforgiving snow. The wind was relentless, whipping her hair across her face, biting her exposed skin, but she kept moving. Because to stop would mean giving in to the cold. To stop was to lose. And she couldn't afford to lose. Rose had cried at first, her tiny sobs barely audible against the wind, but now there was only silence. Elizabeth's heart pounded in her chest, each beat louder than the wind around her. She adjusted Rose's small frame in her arms, pulling her even closer, whispering hoarsely, "We're almost there, sweetheart. Just hold on." But even as the words left her lips, Elizabeth didn't know if that was the truth. She couldn't see where she was going. Everything around her was nothing but white. The sky and the ground blended together into an endless, lifeless horizon. There was no road, no sign of life, just the howling wind and the endless snow. She kept walking. Her legs burned. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest, but she kept moving. Because to stop, to give in, would mean certain death. Her thoughts wandered to her husband, John. It hadn't always been this way. Once, their home had been a warm place filled with laughter and love. But after his death, everything had changed. The world around them had turned as cold as the land they were now struggling to survive in. John had been lost to a brutal accident months before, and since then, it felt as though everything familiar had slipped through her fingers, leaving her and Rose to face the harsh wilderness alone. As she trudged on, her thoughts drifted back to the night she had been forced to leave their cabin. The fire had burned low, the shadows in the room long and menacing. The air had been thick with unspoken words, the kind that hung heavy, suffocating everything around them. Elizabeth had sat with Rose on her lap, trying to keep the girl calm, her arms wrapped tightly around her small frame, but her thoughts were elsewhere. They had nowhere else to go. And her brother-in-law, Sam, had made it clear that there was no place for them there anymore. "You can't stay here," Sam had said, his voice cold, his gaze unreadable. His words had felt like a slap across the face, each one landing with cruel finality. Elizabeth's heart had skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat. "We have nowhere else," she had begged. "We don't need much. Just a place for Rose to sleep and something to eat. I'll work, Sam. I'll do whatever you need." Sam had looked away, glancing at his wife, who sat silently by the hearth, her eyes averted. "We can't even feed ourselves, let alone take you in." Sam's voice had been harsh, each word a blow. A widow with a child? It's too much. Elizabeth had felt the weight of his words, the sting of his refusal digging deep into her chest. "Please," she had whispered. "Please, she's just a child. I don't need much." But Sam had been unmoved. "I'm sorry, but we're not your family anymore, Elizabeth. Not like this." And with that, it had been clear. There was no place for them there. Elizabeth had gathered Rose into her arms and walked to the door without a word, no one stopping her. As she stepped out into the night, she had heard the door close behind her with a resounding thud. The sound of the bolt sliding into place had been the loudest thing she had ever heard. She had walked into the storm, the cold biting at her skin, the snow falling heavily, obscuring her vision. But there was nothing else to do but keep moving. No choice but to walk. The wind howled around Elizabeth, its icy fingers cutting into her skin like 1,000 tiny knives. She could feel the cold creeping under her clothing, seeping into her bones, freezing her from the inside out. Every step felt like it could be her last, but she couldn't stop, not now, not with Rose in her arms, not with the memory of her brother-in-law's harsh words still ringing in her ears. She pushed forward, each step more difficult than the last. The world around her was a blur of white, snow, and sky indistinguishable from one another. There was no road, no sign of civilization, only the relentless storm in the icy expanse that stretched on forever. Her legs burned with every movement, muscles protesting the effort, but she couldn't afford to stop. She had no choice. The wind was cutting through her, and the cold was something that had to be outrun, something that would slow her down until it finally stopped her completely. Rose had stopped crying. The little girl had been so strong, so full of life, but now she was unnervingly quiet, her tiny body slack in Elizabeth's arms. The child had barely made a sound for hours, and Elizabeth's heart clenched with worry. She adjusted her grip, pulling Rose closer, her breath shallow in the frozen air. The silence was suffocating. What if Rose had fallen ill? What if she was too cold, too weak to keep going? Elizabeth pressed on, desperate for a sign, anything to keep hope alive. She needed to get out of this storm, to find shelter before it was too late. Her legs screamed in protest, each step feeling heavier than the last, but she couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. Ahead, through the swirling storm, something appeared. A dark shape, small, distant, but real. A building. A shelter. Hope. Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat as she quickened her pace, her mind racing with the thought of warmth, of safety. But before she could take another step, a sound cut through the howling wind. A low growl, sharp and menacing, froze her in place. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat as her gaze shot to the side, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the swirling snow. There, barely visible through the storm, stood a wolf. Its body was thin, gaunt with hunger, its yellow eyes locked onto her with a predatory gaze. It had been stalking her for some time, Elizabeth realized. It knew she was weak, knew she was moving slower than she should, knew that she was carrying more than she could bear. It had been waiting for this moment, waiting for her to be too slow, too exhausted, to fight back. Rose stirred slightly in Elizabeth's arms, her tiny hands gripping the fabric of her mother's shawl. Elizabeth tightened her hold on her daughter, her heart hammering in her chest. She glanced down at Rose's pale face, her lips blue from the cold. She had a knife tucked into her belt, but what good would it do against a creature like this? The wolf took a slow, deliberate step forward, its muscles coiling beneath its thin frame. Elizabeth's breath came faster, and she shifted Rose behind her, trying to shield the child as best as she could. If it lunged, she would fight. She would lose, but she would fight. She had to. The wolf tensed, its body coiling like a spring, ready to pounce. And then, just as it seemed to launch forward, a shot rang out, the crack of the gun echoing through the valley, shattering the eerie quiet of the storm. The wolf collapsed mid-lunge, its body hitting the snow with a sickening thud. Elizabeth froze, her heart pounding in her chest. For a long moment, there was only the sound of her own breath, harsh and uneven, mingling with the howling wind. She looked up, her eyes widening as she saw the man standing just a short distance away. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy coat dusted with snow. His face was partially obscured by the brim of his hat, but there was no mistaking the rifle in his hands, the barrel still trailing smoke. Elizabeth held Rose tighter against her chest, her pulse racing. The man didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply watched her, his gaze steady and unreadable. "Do you need help?" he asked after a long pause, his voice calm, almost disinterested. Elizabeth hesitated. She wasn't sure if she could trust him, but she had no choice. She looked down at Rose, whose lips had turned a pale shade of blue. The little girl's fingers curled weakly around Elizabeth's shawl. Elizabeth swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, help her." The man nodded once, then took a step closer. His movements were measured, deliberate, and for the first time in days, Elizabeth allowed herself to be helped. She had carried Rose for so long, both physically and emotionally, but now she let someone else carry the weight. He didn't speak much as he led her inside the small cabin, his hands steady and sure as he placed Rose on a cot, covering her with blankets and stoking the fire higher. He moved with quiet efficiency, neither hurried nor hesitant. Elizabeth stood near the door, her breath still unsteady from the cold, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She should feel relief, she knew that, but instead, she felt exposed, vulnerable. The man set down his rifle, leaning it against the wall. "She'll be warmer soon," he said, not looking at Elizabeth. "She needs food. Small amounts at first. If she eats too fast, it'll make her sick." Elizabeth only nodded, too tired to speak. The man stepped away from the cot and reached for a pot hanging near the hearth. The faint scent of broth drifted into the air, and Elizabeth's stomach grumbled, a reminder of how long it had been since she had eaten anything of substance. He poured some broth into a wooden bowl and set it down on the small table. "It ain't much," he said, his voice even, "but it'll help." Elizabeth hesitated for a moment. She should refuse, she thought. He had already done enough. But pride didn't keep a child alive. She crossed the room, slowly lowered herself onto the bench, and wrapped her fingers around the bowl. The warmth seeped into her cold hands, and she lifted the spoon to her lips. The heat startled her, and she swallowed carefully, feeling the warmth settle deep inside her, spreading like something unfamiliar, like hope. The silence in the cabin was thick. The only sound was the soft crackling of the fire as it fed on the wood, and the occasional faint rustle of Elizabeth shifting in her seat. She glanced over at Rose, who lay on the cot, wrapped in thick blankets. Her small chest rose and fell with steady breaths, and some of the color had returned to her pale face. She was still too weak, but Elizabeth could feel the tension in her chest ease a little. Rose would survive this. She had to. Elizabeth lowered her spoon, her hands trembling slightly as she placed it back in the bowl. The warmth of the broth had given her a momentary sense of relief, but now it felt as though the cold inside her was settling back in. She had spent so much of her life trying to survive, trying to keep moving, and yet now, in the stillness of this cabin, with no plans and no future to look forward to, she didn't know what to do next. The man, who had saved them both, sat across the room by the fire. His back was to her, but she could see his silhouette in the glow of the flames. He had said little since they had entered, merely giving her space, letting her focus on Rose. He hadn't asked any questions, hadn't pried into her past or her future. She appreciated that. Most people would have wanted to know everything about her, where she was from, why she was alone, what had happened to her husband. But not this man. He seemed content with the silence, allowing her the time to think without pushing her to speak. Her gaze flicked to the wall, where a single shelf held a few spare items, some dried herbs, a rusted pot, a rough-hewn bowl. This was his life, simple, solitary. But it was a life. And for the first time in days, Elizabeth felt herself wondering if this might be a place to rest. Her thoughts were interrupted when the man, who had introduced himself as Samuel, stood up, stretching his stiff limbs before walking over to the hearth. He adjusted a few logs in the fire, his hands moving with practiced ease. He glanced over at Elizabeth, catching her eye for the briefest of moments. "There's an extra blanket on the shelf," he said, his voice still calm, but with an edge of something unspoken. "If you're cold, you can use it." Elizabeth nodded and stood, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle into her bones. Her body ached from the cold, from the strain of the journey. But more than that, her mind was tired. She couldn't remember the last time she had let herself truly rest. She walked over to the shelf and reached for the heavy woolen blanket. As her fingers brushed the coarse fabric, she hesitated, unsure of what to do next. Should she thank him? Should she ask more about him? Where had he come from? How did he end up in this isolated cabin, alone in the middle of nowhere? Before she could think much further, she draped the blanket around her shoulders. The weight of it was reassuring. Solid. Real. For a moment, Elizabeth felt as though she could breathe, could think clearly again. She sat down by the fire, feeling its warmth seep into her tired limbs. Samuel didn't press her for conversation. He simply continued his work, tending to the fire, his movements purposeful but calm. After a while, Elizabeth found herself watching him. There was something in the way he moved, something steady, sure. His rough hands, the creases in his face, they spoke of a man who had lived through hardships. A man who knew survival, who understood the value of quiet moments like these. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of silence, she spoke, her voice soft but steady. "You live here alone?" Samuel paused for a moment, then nodded. "For a while now," he replied, not elaborating. His voice was quiet but even, as though he had accepted the solitude of this place long ago. Elizabeth's fingers curled around the blanket. "Don't you get lonely?" He shrugged, the motion casual but carrying an undertone of something deeper. "Loneliness is part of it," he said. "You get used to it." The way he said it made Elizabeth pause. She looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. He was a man who had seen hardship, who had been broken by loss, but who had somehow pieced himself together in this quiet, solitary existence. She glanced back at Rose, who had fallen into a deeper sleep. Her little hand clutched the wooden bird that Samuel had carved for her. Elizabeth smiled faintly, a small, bittersweet smile, as she thought of how far they had come. "We had nowhere else to go," she admitted quietly. The words felt heavy, but there was some relief in speaking them. The burden of carrying the truth alone, in silence, had been exhausting. But here, With Samuel's quiet presence, it felt like she could finally let go of the weight, just a little. Samuel nodded, as if he understood more than he let on. "I can tell," he said softly. "You've been through a lot." Elizabeth bit her lip, her heart aching at the thought of all they had lost. John, the life they had once known. And now, Rose's future uncertain, her own path unclear. She swallowed hard, looking down at her hands, the small, cracked skin from the cold and the work they had done to survive. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking slightly, "for helping us." Samuel didn't respond right away. He simply sat down across from her, near the fire, watching her with steady eyes. His presence was unwavering, but not in an intrusive way. He wasn't a man who needed to be at the center of everything. He was just there, steady as the flames that flickered between them. The fire crackled, and Elizabeth felt herself relax for the first time in days, the heat from the hearth working its way into her bones. Maybe, just maybe, this was a place where they could rest, where they could begin again. The next morning arrived quietly, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the soft rustle of the wind outside the cabin. Elizabeth woke to the warmth that had settled into the room, something she hadn't felt in what seemed like forever. For the first time in days, she didn't feel the crushing weight of the cold pressing against her chest. She took a deep breath, savoring the heat that surrounded her, and glanced over at Rose. The little girl was still asleep, her small face peaceful for once, no longer pinched with the cold or fear. Elizabeth's heart swelled with gratitude at the sight. Rose was going to be okay. She stood quietly, careful not to wake her daughter, and made her way to the stove. The faint scent of coffee lingered in the air, and she felt an odd sense of comfort in the simple routine of the morning. Samuel was already up, his movements slow and purposeful as he worked at the stove, preparing something. Elizabeth watched him for a moment, noting how the morning light softened the sharp lines of his face, the quiet focus in his eyes. He glanced up at her, noticing her gaze. "Coffee's ready," he said with a small, almost imperceptible smile. "If you want some." Elizabeth hesitated for a moment, but then, driven by the need for warmth and normalcy, she nodded and crossed the room to pour herself a cup. The hot liquid was bitter but grounding, its warmth filling her body in a way that made her feel more connected to the present moment than she had in a long time. Samuel sat at the table, his gaze fixed on the wood in his hands. He was whittling again, a small block of wood taking shape beneath his steady hands. The rhythm of the knife against the grain was a comforting sound, something simple yet profound in its steady cadence. Elizabeth sat down across from him, taking a sip of her coffee. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice almost lost in the stillness of the cabin, "for letting us stay." Samuel didn't look up immediately, but his lips twitched slightly, as though he was holding back a smile. "You don't have to thank me," he said, his voice rough but not unkind. "It's just a roof." But Elizabeth knew it was more than that. It was safety, it was kindness in the midst of a cold world that seemed to have little left to offer. It was warmth, and she hadn't realized how desperately she had needed it until she had found it. "You don't ask questions," she said after a pause, looking at him curiously. "Most people would have wanted to know more about us, where we came from, what happened, how we ended up in the middle of a snowstorm." Samuel's knife paused in midair, and he glanced up at her, his eyes steady. "I've learned that sometimes silence speaks more than questions." Elizabeth studied him for a moment, his words hanging in the air between them. She didn't ask him any more questions, though she wanted to. She wanted to know more about him, about his life before this cabin, before the solitude. But something in his presence told her that some things were best left unspoken. Some things were meant to stay in the quiet. The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was easy, like the fire that crackled softly in the hearth, the flickering light casting long shadows across the walls. After a while, Samuel set down his knife and stood up, stretching his stiff limbs. "There's a trail beyond the trees," he said, breaking the silence. "I can show you if you'd like. It might be safer than trying to find your way through the snow." Elizabeth looked at him, her heart skipping a beat. The thought of leaving the cabin, of venturing into the wilderness again, was daunting. But the road outside would soon be passable, the storm had cleared, and the world outside was waiting to be faced. She couldn't stay here forever, could she? Elizabeth hesitated, then stopped herself. What was she afraid of? What was holding her back? "I'll go." Samuel nodded once, as though he had expected the answer. He didn't press her, didn't ask anything more. He simply walked to the door, reaching for his heavy coat and hat. He pulled the door open, letting the cold air rush in. "I'll wait for you outside," he said, stepping into the snow. Elizabeth stood up, looking over at Rose, who was still fast asleep, wrapped in the warmth of the blankets. For a moment, she hesitated. She could leave her here, let her rest while she took the step forward, but something deep inside her urged her not to. She grabbed her coat and wrapped it tightly around her shoulders before stepping outside into the sharp morning air. The cold hit her face like a slap, but it didn't feel as suffocating as it had before. The world was white and still, the storm's fury now only a distant memory. Samuel was already waiting near the woodpile, his figure outlined against the bright snow. He didn't turn to look at her, but he nodded slightly as she walked toward him. "You ready?" he asked, his voice steady. Elizabeth took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision settling on her. She had been running for so long, running from the past, from the uncertainty of the future. But maybe it was time to stop running. Maybe it was time to face whatever came next. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady, though her heart raced in her chest. And with that, they began to walk. The trail Samuel had spoken of was nothing more than a narrow path, barely visible beneath the fresh layer of snow. But it was a path, and that gave Elizabeth a sense of direction she had long been lacking. The cold air stung her cheeks, but she hardly noticed it now. The wind had subsided, and all that remained was the quiet crunch of their boots in the snow. They walked side by side, not speaking, the silence between them no longer heavy but comfortable, like the unspoken understanding that passed between them. Elizabeth couldn't help but steal glances at Samuel every so often. He moved with such ease, as though the wilds of the world had long been his companion. His shoulders were squared, his step sure, and even though they were both heading into the unknown, he exuded a quiet confidence she had come to admire. It didn't take long before they reached the base of a small ridge, and from there, the world seemed to stretch endlessly before them. The cabin had been nestled in a valley, sheltered from the worst of the storms, but now they were standing at the edge of the wild. Elizabeth felt both exhilarated and terrified at the same time. The unknown stretched out before her, vast and unyielding. But in that vastness, there was freedom, a sense of possibility. "How far is it?" Elizabeth asked, breaking the silence at last. Samuel glanced over at her, his face unreadable, but there was a slight glint in his eyes. "Not far. You'll see the markers soon." Elizabeth nodded, not entirely sure what he meant by marker, but trusting him nonetheless. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't fighting against the current of her own life. She was moving forward, taking each step as it came, and somehow that was enough. The trail wound its way through dense trees and underbrush, and Elizabeth felt herself beginning to relax. The rhythm of their walking, the steady crunch of snow beneath their feet, had a calming effect on her. The world felt smaller out here, more contained, and for a moment, she felt like she could breathe. They had been walking for what seemed like hours when the sound of a bird's cry broke the silence. Elizabeth looked up just as a large hawk soared overhead, its wings cutting through the air with effortless grace. She stopped for a moment, watching the bird as it disappeared into the sky. Samuel, noticing her pause, slowed his pace. "You ever seen a hawk up close?" he asked casually, his voice breaking through the stillness. Elizabeth shook her head, her gaze still fixed on the sky. "No," she said quietly. "I've seen them from a distance, but never up close." Samuel didn't respond right away. He just nodded and kept walking. But his words hung in the air between them, as if they carried more weight than she realized. There was something about that hawk, its freedom, its purpose, that resonated with Elizabeth. It reminded her of something she had once known, something she had once felt before everything had turned upside down. As they continued, the path grew steeper, and the snow thickened beneath their feet. The trees thinned out, revealing a wide clearing ahead. And there, in the center of the clearing, stood a small wooden cabin, much like the one they had just left, but with one key difference: it looked well-maintained. Smoke rose from the chimney, and the sight of it stirred something deep inside Elizabeth, something like hope. Samuel stopped just before the cabin, turning to face Elizabeth. "This is it," he said, his voice softer now. "We'll rest here for a while, and then we can figure out what comes next." Elizabeth took a step forward, her breath catching in her throat. She hadn't expected to find a place like this. The cabin seemed almost magical, nestled against the backdrop of snow-covered trees, the faint warmth of life emanating from within. For the first time in what felt like years, Elizabeth allowed herself to feel a glimmer of something she hadn't felt in so long: safety. Samuel led the way inside, and Elizabeth followed, her eyes scanning the small, rustic interior. It was simple, but it had everything they would need. Firewood stacked neatly by the hearth, a small table with a few chairs, and shelves filled with supplies. "Make yourself comfortable," Samuel said, walking over to the fire and adding a few logs. "I'll check the supplies." Elizabeth nodded, still taking in the cabin. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It felt like a place where they could rest, where they could stop running. And for the first time in days, Elizabeth allowed herself to sit down by the fire, her body sinking into the warmth of it. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the heat fill her bones, the exhaustion from the long journey finally catching up to her. It wasn't until a while later that Samuel returned, a small pot of stew in his hands. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need," he said, setting the pot down on the table. "But I won't lie, staying here for too long might make things difficult for you. Eventually, the roads will clear, and you'll need to decide what comes next." Elizabeth nodded slowly, the weight of his words sinking in. She had known, deep down, that this moment would come. They couldn't stay here forever. She couldn't keep hiding from the world, from the life she had lost and a future she had to rebuild. But for now, just for now, she would allow herself to rest, to breathe, to feel safe. Samuel sat across from her, his hands still rough from the cold and the work of living in solitude. "What will you do?" he asked, his voice gentle but direct. "Where will you go after this?" Elizabeth paused, her gaze flickering over to Rose, who was still curled up on the cot, sleeping peacefully. "I don't know yet," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But for the first time in a long time, I'm not scared to find out." The days that followed were a blur of warmth and quiet routine. The world outside the cabin had changed, no longer a frozen wasteland of endless snow, but a realm of possibility. The storms had subsided, and the landscape was slowly beginning to thaw. The roads, still covered in snow and ice, were becoming passable again. And with that, Elizabeth knew their time in this small cabin was coming to an end. Each morning, she helped Samuel with the chores, gathering firewood, cleaning the cabin, and preparing meals. It was simple work, but it allowed her to focus on the present, to focus on the life they were building, even if only for a brief moment. Rose was slowly recovering, her health returning as the warmth of the cabin seeped into her bones. The little girl's laughter, though quiet, had returned, and Elizabeth felt a sense of peace she had not felt in what seemed like forever. But even as the days passed, a part of her knew that this peace was fleeting. The world outside was calling to them, beckoning them to move on. They couldn't stay in this small cabin forever, and Elizabeth wasn't sure where they would go once they left. She had no family left to turn to, no home to return to. And then, one evening, as she sat by the fire, a thought crossed her mind, one that had been growing stronger in her heart over the past few days. She looked up at Samuel, who was sitting across from her, his eyes fixed on the fire. He had been so steady, so reliable, that Elizabeth couldn't help but feel a growing sense of attachment to him. But was it wise to stay here? To let herself become comfortable in a life she hadn't planned? "Samuel," she began, her voice hesitant. "What do you think we should do next? I mean, after this, when the roads are clear, what's waiting for us?" Samuel didn't respond immediately. He simply stared into the fire, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly he spoke. "I can't tell you what comes next for you, Elizabeth," he said quietly, his voice low but steady. "But I can tell you that you're not alone anymore. Not in this moment. And that counts for something." Elizabeth's heart skipped a beat, and she felt the weight of his words sink deep into her chest. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. She had known, deep down, that this was the reason she had made it this far. It wasn't just the cabin or the warmth or even the safety that had kept her going. It was the connection, the sense that, for once, she wasn't fighting the world on her own. That, for the first time in so long, someone was willing to walk beside her. She swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to be alone anymore." Samuel glanced over at her, his gaze steady. "You don't have to be, but you have to decide what you want. The world doesn't stop for anyone, Elizabeth. It keeps moving." She nodded, understanding the weight of his words. It was true. She couldn't hide away forever. She couldn't stay in this cabin, in this moment, without facing the truth of what lay ahead. But for the first time in a long time, Elizabeth felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't alone, and that meant everything. The next morning, the sun rose high over the mountains, casting a golden light over the snow-covered landscape. Elizabeth stood at the window of the cabin, looking out over the world beyond. The sky was a brilliant shade of blue, and the first signs of spring were beginning to show. The earth was thawing, the trees beginning to bud, and for the first time in months, Elizabeth felt like she could breathe. Rose was still asleep in the cot, her small body curled up under the blankets, but Elizabeth knew it was time. They couldn't stay here forever. It was time to move on. She turned away from the window and walked over to Samuel, who was preparing the fire. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to say what was in her heart. "Samuel," she said softly, "I think it's time we left." He looked up at her, his face neutral but his eyes understanding. "I figured you'd say that. The world's not going to wait for you forever." Elizabeth exhaled slowly, a weight lifting from her chest. "I'm ready. For whatever comes next." Samuel nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "We'll figure it out, together." Together. The word felt like a promise, a lifeline. Elizabeth didn't know where they would go next, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She had a future to face, and with Samuel beside her, she knew she wouldn't have to face it alone. The morning passed quietly, the last remnants of the storm fading into the distant peaks, leaving a vast, untouched world behind. The cabin that had sheltered Elizabeth and Rose for the past few days felt more like a memory now, its walls holding their stories, but not their future. The air outside was sharp, a reminder that they could no longer hide from the cold, nor from the unknown that lay ahead. Samuel was already packing what little he had, gathering his tools and the few supplies he had kept stashed in the corner of the cabin. Elizabeth watched him, feeling the pull of a new beginning settle in her chest. The uncertainty was still there, gnawing at her insides, but it was different now. It didn't feel like an insurmountable wall. It felt like a challenge. She turned to check on Rose, who had woken up in the midst of their quiet preparations. The girl sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes as she glanced around the cabin. She looked up at Elizabeth, her small face filled with quiet curiosity. Elizabeth smiled softly, crossing the room to sit beside her. "Good morning, sweetheart," she whispered, brushing a strand of hair from Rose's face. "Are we leaving?" Rose asked, her voice small but clear. Elizabeth nodded, her heart aching at the thought of how much her daughter had already been through. "Yes, we're going to keep moving, just like we always do. But this time, we have a place to go, and we're not alone." Rose didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked down at the wooden bird Samuel had carved for her, its smooth surface resting in her lap. Elizabeth had noticed how Rose had started to carry it with her everywhere, a silent comfort in the midst of all the chaos. "We'll be okay, won't we, Mama?" Rose asked quietly, her fingers tracing the edges of the little carving. Elizabeth felt a surge of warmth flood her chest. Rose had always been resilient, stronger than most people gave her credit for. But Elizabeth knew how much her daughter had been through, how much they both had. It was a tough road they were walking, but with Rose's quiet strength and Samuel's steady presence, Elizabeth felt like maybe, just maybe, they could find their way. "We'll be okay," Elizabeth said, her voice firm, even though uncertainty still lingered in her heart. "We'll figure it out, one step at a time." She stood up and turned to Samuel, who had finished preparing. He was watching her, his eyes steady, unreadable as usual. But this time, she didn't feel the same unease. There was something about him, something unspoken, that made her feel grounded, like maybe he was the missing piece she hadn't realized she needed. "Are you ready?" Samuel asked, breaking her train of thought. Elizabeth hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yes." They walked out of the cabin together, the door creaking shut behind them. The snow crunched beneath their boots as they stepped into the bright morning light. Elizabeth breathed in deeply, the cold air filling her lungs, sharp but refreshing. For the first time in days, it felt like she could start again. Rose clung to Elizabeth's side, her small hand wrapped around her mother's fingers. Elizabeth glanced down at her, and for the first time since they had left their old life behind, she didn't feel like she was dragging her daughter along on a hopeless journey. They were walking together, both of them moving towards something new. There was no roadmap for what came next, but maybe that was okay. "Where do we go from here?" Elizabeth asked Samuel as they made their way toward the ridge. Samuel didn't answer immediately. His gaze was fixed ahead, his face half hidden by the brim of his hat. For a long time, there was only the crunch of snow beneath their feet and the distant cry of birds overhead. Then, finally, Samuel spoke. "First, we get through the pass. After that, we'll figure it out. There's always a way forward if you're willing to keep moving." His words were simple, but there was a depth to them that made Elizabeth pause. She wasn't sure if it was the weight of his past, the way he carried himself, or just the quiet confidence he had in the face of so much uncertainty, but his words struck her deep. She didn't have to know what came next. She didn't have to have all the answers. She just had to keep moving forward, just as Samuel had said. And for the first time, that felt like enough. The path ahead was steep, but they walked it together. The air was thin, the cold still biting at their skin, but the sun was high now, and the world seemed more alive than it had in weeks. The mountains rose around them, tall and mighty, silent sentinels watching over the land. After a few hours of walking, they reached the crest of the ridge, and Elizabeth paused to look out over the expanse of snow-covered land. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw the landscape stretching out before them, vast and endless, but also full of promise. There were no roads, no clear markers to follow, but in that moment, Elizabeth knew that the world was waiting for them. It had been waiting for her to stop running, to stop hiding. She turned to Samuel, a small but genuine smile on her face. "Thank you," she said quietly. He looked at her, his expression unchanged, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something she couldn't quite place. "Don't thank me yet," he said with a small smile. "We've still got a long way to go." Elizabeth nodded, feeling the weight of his words. They still had a long way to go, but she wasn't afraid anymore. They would figure it out. Together. The journey from the ridge took longer than they had anticipated. The trail was rough, the snow deeper than it had seemed from afar, but with each step, Elizabeth felt herself growing stronger. There was something about moving forward, about pushing through the discomfort, that made her feel alive again. For the first time since they had lost everything, she felt like she had a purpose, a direction. They stopped for the night in a small grove of trees, where Samuel gathered firewood with practiced ease. The fire they built crackled and popped, its warm glow casting flickering shadows around them. Elizabeth sat beside it, watching the flames dance, her mind turning over everything she had learned in the past few days. The cabin they had left behind had been a temporary refuge, a safe haven when they needed it most. But now, out here in the wilderness, with the wind howling through the trees and the sky slowly darkening, Elizabeth felt a deeper connection to the world around her. The world had always been harsh, unforgiving, but here, in the heart of it, she felt something else, possibility, the chance to rebuild, the chance to start over. Rose, now wrapped in a heavy blanket, sat near the fire, playing with the wooden bird Samuel had carved for her. Elizabeth smiled at the sight. Her daughter had grown quiet and withdrawn after everything that had happened, but now she seemed more relaxed, more at ease with the world around her. The storm had passed, and with it, Rose was beginning to heal, not just physically, but emotionally as well. Samuel looked over at Elizabeth, his expression unreadable, as usual. But there was something in his eyes that suggested he understood her better than anyone ever had. "You know," he said after a long pause, his voice low, "it's not just about surviving. It's about learning to live with what you've got." Elizabeth raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you mean?" He shrugged slightly, as though the answer was simple. "We've all got baggage, right? Things we've lost, things we've done. But you can't carry it forever. You have to learn to live with it, move with it. It doesn't define you unless you let it." She nodded slowly, taking in his words. It wasn't the first time she had heard such sentiments, but hearing them from Samuel felt different. It was as if he understood that survival was only half the battle. The real challenge came when you had to keep going, when you had to pick up the pieces and keep moving forward. "I've never been very good at letting go," Elizabeth admitted, her voice quiet. "I thought I could handle everything on my own, that I could fix everything if I just tried hard enough." Samuel didn't respond right away. He simply watched her, his gaze steady. "It's not about fixing things," he said finally. "It's about accepting them." His words hung in the air for a moment before he stood up, walking toward the edge of the grove. Elizabeth watched him, trying to process what he had said. There was a depth to him, something that went beyond survival. He had an understanding of the world that she hadn't realized she was missing. "I don't know if I'll ever get to the point where I can accept everything," Elizabeth murmured, more to herself than to him. "But maybe I don't have to do it all at once." Samuel paused, glancing over his shoulder. "No one expects you to. Take it one step at a time, Elizabeth. One day at a time." She nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle deep within her. There was no deadline to healing, no end point to this journey. All she had to do was keep moving, keep trying, and maybe, just maybe, the pieces would begin to fall into place. That night, They sat around the fire in a comfortable silence, the warmth of the flames wrapping around them like a blanket. The wind had died down, and the stars above were sharp and clear, as though the world was breathing with them, moving in sync with their quiet rhythm. The next morning, they set off again, the sun rising behind them, casting long shadows across the snow. The landscape around them was breathtaking, the pristine white of the snow contrasting with the dark outlines of the trees and the jagged peaks that loomed in the distance. It was a world of extremes, both beautiful and harsh, but Elizabeth felt like she was starting to see it for what it was. Not something to fear, but something to embrace. They walked through the day, moving steadily, but with no real sense of urgency. They stopped at midday to eat, sharing what little they had left in their packs, simple bread, dried meat, and water from the stream that ran nearby. It wasn't much, but it was enough. By the time the sun began to set, casting the world in golden hues, they had reached another ridge. From there, they could see the valley below, the path winding down toward a small cluster of buildings in the distance. Elizabeth's heart gave a jolt. There, in the distance, was a town, a place where they could rest, a place where they could find answers, or at least, a new beginning. Samuel stopped beside her, his gaze fixed on the town below. "You ready?" he asked, his voice quiet but steady. Elizabeth swallowed, a mix of anticipation and fear swirling in her chest. "I think so," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think I'm ready." The town below was small, nestled in the valley between two high ridges. The buildings, mostly wooden, looked worn but sturdy, with smoke rising from chimneys into the cool evening air. For a moment, Elizabeth felt an overwhelming sense of relief, a sensation she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. This place, this little town, could be the refuge they needed. It could be the place to finally lay down the weight they had carried for so long. Samuel didn't speak as they made their way down the ridge toward the town. Elizabeth followed close behind, her hand tightly gripping Rose's. The little girl had grown more confident in the past few days, but she still seemed quiet, lost in her own thoughts. Elizabeth couldn't blame her. There was no telling what kind of life they would find in this new place. The closer they got, the more details of the town came into view. A few people walked along the streets, bundled against the cold, but there was no rush, no sense of urgency. It felt like a town that lived in rhythm with the land, slow, steady, and enduring. Elizabeth's pulse quickened slightly. She had always been on the move, always looking over her shoulder, never quite sure of where she was headed. But now, for the first time in a long time, the future felt within reach. As they entered the town, Elizabeth's eyes scanned the faces of the people around her. There were no welcoming smiles, no curious stares. People simply went about their business, going in and out of buildings, some carrying bundles of firewood, others leading horses into stables. It was as though they were just another part of the landscape, nothing extraordinary, nothing special. But to Elizabeth, it felt like a new world, one where she and Rose could begin again. She was determined to make it work, to find a place where they could finally rest, where they could begin to heal. They made their way to a small tavern at the edge of town, its sign swaying gently in the breeze. Samuel pushed open the door, and the warm glow of the fire inside hit them like a wave. Elizabeth's shoulders, stiff from the cold, seemed to relax as the heat enveloped her. She hadn't realized how cold she had been until that moment. Inside, the air smelled of stew and wood smoke, and the chatter of the few patrons was warm and inviting. The tavern keeper, a stout man with graying hair and a thick mustache, looked up as they entered. His eyes lingered on them for a moment, and then he smiled, the lines around his eyes softening. "Well, what have we here?" he said, his voice deep and rich. "Looks like you've had quite the journey." Elizabeth smiled, though she felt a pang of nervousness twist in her stomach. "It's been a long one," she said quietly. "We're looking for a place to stay for the night." "Of course," the tavern keeper replied, gesturing to a table near the fire. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need. The storm's cleared, but the roads are still treacherous. Not many folks will be traveling for a while." Samuel nodded, as if he already knew what was to come. "We'll take a meal," he said, his voice low but firm, "and some space for the night." The tavern keeper gave a quick nod and turned toward the back, where a small kitchen could be seen through an open door. The scent of cooking food grew stronger, and Elizabeth's stomach growled in response. They hadn't eaten much during their journey, and the thought of a warm meal filled her with a sense of comfort she hadn't realized she was missing. They settled at the table by the fire, and Samuel began to speak with the tavern keeper in low tones, discussing the state of the town and what the next few days might bring. Elizabeth glanced around, taking in the surroundings. The tavern was small, but it had a certain charm. A few old wooden beams crisscrossed the ceiling, and a large hearth dominated one wall, its fire crackling merrily. There were shelves filled with bottles of liquor and a few small trinkets, giving the place a sense of homey disorder. Rose, who had been unusually quiet during the entire journey, was now tugging at the hem of Elizabeth's coat, her eyes wide. "Mama, can we stay here?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Elizabeth looked down at her daughter, her heart aching at the sight of her vulnerability. She had grown so much in the past few days, and yet she was still just a little girl who had been through too much. "We'll see, sweetheart," she said gently. "We'll see what happens next." Just then, the tavern keeper returned with a tray of food, stew, warm bread, and a pot of tea. The rich smell of the stew made Elizabeth's mouth water, and she felt a sudden, overwhelming exhaustion hit her. She hadn't realized how much she had been running on empty until now. She was ready to rest. "Here you go," the tavern keeper said, setting the tray down in front of them. "Eat up, and take all the time you need. There's a room upstairs if you need it. It's not much, but it'll keep the cold out." Elizabeth nodded, smiling at him in thanks. She could feel the tension in her shoulders begin to melt away as she took a bite of the stew. It was simple but hearty, the warmth of it filling her and spreading through her limbs. After a few minutes of quiet eating, Elizabeth set her spoon down and looked at Samuel. He was watching her with his usual steady gaze, his expression unreadable but not unfriendly. "What happens next?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do we do now?" Samuel took a slow sip of his drink before responding. "We live. We take it one day at a time." Elizabeth felt a sense of peace wash over her at his words. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was enough. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't looking over her shoulder. She wasn't afraid of what the future held, because in this moment, she had everything she needed: hope, safety, and the strength to move forward. They ate in silence for a while longer, and when they were finished, the tavern keeper led them upstairs to a small but cozy room. The bed was simple but soft, and the fire crackled warmly in the corner. Elizabeth helped Rose settle in, pulling the blankets up around her daughter and kissing her forehead. "We're safe now," Elizabeth whispered, her voice full of quiet assurance. And as she stood there, watching Rose drift off to sleep, Elizabeth allowed herself to finally let go. The road ahead would be uncertain, yes, but for the first time, she felt like it was hers to walk. Road ahead. The morning light filtered through the window of the small room, casting a soft glow across the wooden floor. Elizabeth woke slowly, her body still tired from the long days of travel, but the rest had done her good. She glanced over at Rose, who was still asleep, her small face peaceful and serene. It felt like a blessing to see her daughter at rest, to know that for the first time in a long while, she was not worried about the next storm or the next battle. Elizabeth stretched and rose from the bed, careful not to wake Rose. The room was quiet except for the occasional crackle of the fire in the corner. She dressed quickly, pulling on her coat and wrapping a scarf around her neck. She wasn't sure what the day would bring, but she knew they couldn't stay here forever. The town, though warm and welcoming, wasn't a place they could settle in permanently. They needed to keep moving, to find their place in the world again. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her decision settle in her chest. It was time to face the future, to stop waiting for something to happen and start making things happen. She wasn't sure where they would go next, but she knew she couldn't do it alone anymore. Samuel, for all his quiet strength, had become a part of this journey in a way that felt natural, like they were walking the same path, side by side. She stepped quietly into the tavern downstairs, where the soft murmur of conversation and the clink of mugs greeted her. The tavern keeper, a man with kind eyes and a gruff but warm demeanor, was behind the bar, wiping down the counter. "Morning," he said with a nod. "Sleep well?" Elizabeth smiled, though her mind was already elsewhere. "Yes, thank you. It's a nice place you have here." "It's not much, but it'll do for now," the tavern keeper replied with a shrug. "We're not a big town, but we get by." Elizabeth nodded, but she didn't want to dwell on the small talk. She needed to make a plan, figure out what came next. But first, she needed to speak with Samuel. She spotted him sitting by the fire, his face still partly in shadow as he watched the flames flicker. She walked over to him, the heat from the fire wrapping around her like a blanket. Samuel glanced up as she approached, his gaze steady as always. "Good morning," Elizabeth said, sitting down beside him. "Have you thought about what we should do next?" Samuel looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he exhaled slowly, as if weighing his words carefully. "We keep moving," he said simply. "One step at a time." Elizabeth felt a pang of frustration. Of course he would say that. He was always so steady, so certain in his quiet way. But she needed more than just the next step. She needed a direction. "I don't know what to do after this," she admitted, her voice tight. "We can't stay here forever. And I can't keep running. I need to know where we're headed." Samuel didn't answer right away. He studied her with his calm, unwavering gaze, as though he were trying to understand her unspoken fears. Finally, he spoke, his voice soft but firm. "Maybe it's not about knowing exactly where we're headed. Maybe it's about finding the courage to take the next step, even when the path isn't clear." Elizabeth let out a slow breath, considering his words. There was truth in them, more than she wanted to admit. She had been so focused on finding a destination, a place to call home again, that she had forgotten how to move forward without certainty. "Maybe you're right," she said quietly. "Maybe it's just about moving." She glanced at Rose, who was now awake and sitting at the table, her fingers tracing the edge of the wooden bird Samuel had carved. Elizabeth smiled at her daughter, feeling a sense of peace settle in her heart. Rose was strong. She always had been. And as long as they were together, they could face whatever came next. "I think it's time we go," Elizabeth said, standing up. "But we go on our own terms, not because we have no choice." Samuel looked at her, his eyes unreadable for a moment, then nodded. "All right. We'll head out after breakfast." They spent the rest of the morning preparing for their departure. The tavern keeper gave them some supplies for the road, mostly bread and dried meat, and wished them well on their journey. Elizabeth didn't know what the next town would be like, or where they would end up, but for the first time, she felt a sense of control. She was no longer running from her past, she was walking toward her future. By midday, they were packed and ready to leave. Samuel led the way out of the tavern, with Elizabeth and Rose following closely behind. The sun had risen high in the sky, casting a golden light over the landscape. The snow was still thick on the ground, but it wasn't as cold as it had been. The world felt different now, less like a place of danger and more like a place of possibility. As they made their way out of the town, Elizabeth looked back one last time. The little tavern, the kind people they had met, and the warmth they had found here would always be a part of their journey. But it was time to move forward. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was theirs to walk. And with every step, Elizabeth felt a little lighter, a little more at peace. They had survived the worst of it, and now, with Rose by her side and Samuel's quiet strength to guide them, they were ready to face whatever came next. The road stretched out before them, winding through hills and forests, leading toward an uncertain future. The town they had left behind was a small dot in the distance, fading into the landscape as they moved farther away. Samuel walked ahead, his pace steady and sure, as though he had done this 1,000 times before. Elizabeth and Rose followed closely behind, the weight of their past still clinging to them. But with every step, that burden grew lighter. As they moved further from the town, the world around them grew quieter. The chirping of birds had disappeared, and the occasional sound of wind rustling through the trees seemed like a distant memory. There was nothing left but the steady crunch of snow beneath their feet and the rhythmic sound of their breathing. The silence was both comforting and unsettling, as if they were walking not just through the land, but through time itself. They had no map, no real destination, but somehow, that didn't matter. Elizabeth had come to realize that it wasn't about the destination at all. It was about the journey. It was about finding peace in the movement itself, in the rhythm of life that didn't require answers, just the courage to keep going. The hours passed in silence, and as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the landscape in hues of pink and orange, Elizabeth felt something shift inside her. The quiet, the stillness, had given her time to think, to reflect on everything that had brought her here. The loss, the pain, the uncertainty, but also the hope, the unexpected kindness of strangers, the strength of her daughter, and most importantly, the realization that she was still capable of choosing. She wasn't defined by what had happened to her, or by what she had lost. She was defined by the choices she made moving forward. And today, she had chosen to keep walking. She had chosen to live. "Samuel," she said, breaking the silence. "Where are we really going?" Samuel didn't turn to look at her right away. He kept walking, his steps slow and deliberate. Finally, he answered, his voice low, yet filled with quiet conviction. "We're going wherever we need to go. The road will show us where to stop." His words made sense, more than she could have anticipated. It wasn't about the place they reached, but the fact that they kept going. And as long as they kept moving, there would always be a new chance, a new beginning waiting just beyond the horizon. But there was one thing Elizabeth still hadn't shared with Samuel. The thing that had been gnawing at her since they first set foot on the road. The thing that she had tried to ignore, hoping it would disappear with time. But it hadn't, and it wouldn't. She slowed her pace and caught up to Samuel, her heart pounding. Samuel, He stopped walking, his head tilting slightly to one side. What's wrong? Elizabeth swallowed hard, her mind racing. She couldn't go on without saying this. I'm not sure I can do this. The road, the future. It's so uncertain. I'm afraid, Samuel. I don't know what's next. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with my life. Samuel studied her in silence for a moment, as though weighing her words. Then, without saying anything, he reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but it was enough. The warmth of his touch grounded her, as if reassuring her that everything she was feeling was okay. You don't have to have all the answers right now, he said quietly. None of us do. We're just walking, Elizabeth. And as long as we keep walking, the answers will come. Elizabeth closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to let go of the fear, the worry, and the need for control. She didn't need to know everything. She just needed to keep moving forward. And so they did. They walked through the night, the stars above them guiding their way. The world felt infinite in its silence, vast and open, offering endless possibilities. There was no telling what tomorrow would bring. But for the first time in a long time, Elizabeth felt ready to face it. By morning, the road had narrowed, leading them into a dense forest where the trees grew taller, casting long shadows across the snow. Elizabeth glanced over at Rose, who was walking with her head held high, her small footsteps leaving prints in the snow. Rose was a reminder to her of what truly mattered: hope, love, and the ability to keep going no matter what. She had lost so much, but in her daughter's eyes, Elizabeth saw a future she could believe in. Look ahead, Samuel said, his voice carrying a hint of excitement. Elizabeth followed his gaze, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she saw something else, something real. There, in the distance, was a clearing, a new beginning, a place to rest. It wasn't a destination that mattered. It was the journey, the choice to keep moving. And in this moment, that was enough. The clearing ahead was small, a peaceful space where the forest gave way to a gentle slope, bathed in soft, golden sunlight. Elizabeth felt a flutter of something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. It was not the dramatic, life-altering kind of hope, but a quiet, steady kind that crept into her bones, filling her with the understanding that, for once, they had found a place to pause, a place to rest. The trees behind them rustled gently in the breeze, the soft sound like a lullaby, as if the world itself was singing them to sleep. Rose, walking beside her, looked up at the sky with wide eyes, marveling at the sight of the open space ahead. She seemed more alive than Elizabeth had ever seen her, her shoulders no longer burdened by the weight of the past. Elizabeth glanced at Samuel, whose gaze was fixed on the clearing. There was something different about him now. He had always been steady, but now he seemed lighter, as if the road had lifted some unseen weight from his shoulders as well. Together, they had walked through the hardest of times, and together, they had found their way. They reached the edge of the clearing, and Elizabeth stopped for a moment, taking it all in. The sight of the land stretching out before them was both overwhelming and beautiful. The journey, with all its hardships and uncertainties, had brought them here. And for the first time, Elizabeth felt as though they had arrived, not at a destination, but at a new chapter in their story. This is it, she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of everything they had been through. We made it. Samuel nodded, his expression as calm as ever, but Elizabeth could see the faintest trace of something in his eyes, a sense of contentment, maybe even relief. This is just the beginning, he said. Elizabeth smiled at his words. It wasn't about the destination, not really. It was about everything that had led them here, the strength, the choices, the small acts of kindness along the way. It was about finding hope in the places where they least expected it. And most importantly, it was about trusting that even in the darkest times, there was always a way forward. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. The warmth of the evening light touched Elizabeth's face, and for the first time in years, she felt at peace. She had let go of the fear that had ruled her life for so long, and in its place was a quiet understanding. The future was always uncertain, but as long as they kept moving forward, they would find their way. Come on, she said, reaching out for Rose's hand. Let's make a home here. Rose's eyes lit up, and she squeezed her mother's hand tightly. Samuel walked beside them, a steady presence as always, but this time, Elizabeth didn't feel as though she was walking alone. They were together. They were safe. And that was enough. As they made their way into the clearing, Elizabeth couldn't help but glance back over her shoulder one last time. The road they had traveled, the memories of loss and pain, were behind them now, fading with each step. Ahead, there was only the promise of a new beginning. The wind whispered through the trees, and Elizabeth smiled. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But she had her daughter, she had Samuel, and she had the courage to keep moving forward. And in this moment, that was enough.